Okay, so in this first lecture, I will cover the first set of readings which come from this book, The Birth and Death of Meaning, written by the late cultural anthropologist Ernest Becker. This is actually the first of 3 books that Becker wrote, so I guess you could say it's the first of a trilogy. I've also assigned readings from his second book, The Denial of Death, and his third book, Escape from Evil, but for this lecture, I'm going to focus on this first book, which provides the groundwork for a lot of the ideas that we'll talk about for the next few months. Okay, so The Birth and Death of Meaning was written in 1962 and then revised in 1971. And in it, Becker is basically what he's trying to do is to piece together all of the major insights gleaned from the social and biological sciences up to that point and put them together and to try to answer the broad question, why do people do the things that they do? Okay, that was his principal obsession, was to try to understand why people act the way they do. And also, what is the engine that's really driving human behavior? Okay, so those are 2 broad questions that he was trying to answer. And in the process of answering those questions, he also answers in this book, or tries to answer, at least 4 other important questions, such as why do people need self-esteem? How does the need for self-esteem develop? What psychological functions do cultures serve? And why is prejudice so pervasive? All right, so because I'm having you read a lot of material from Becker's 3 books, I obviously like his analysis and think it has a lot to offer. As such, I'd like to just take some time and briefly point out at least 3 things about his analysis that I really like, things that offer some credibility to his approach. So the first is that he was interdisciplinary, which just means that he examined his research questions from the perspective of many disciplines, not just one. Becker felt very strongly that if you're asking broad questions like, why do people do what they do, then such broad questions also require wide-ranging scrutiny. If you only approach that question from the perspective of one discipline, like psychology, then you might miss out on a really important piece to the puzzle. In fact, Becker was in the hospital dying of cancer, and he was asked on his deathbed what accomplishment he was most proud of. And he said he was most proud that he was able to remain interdisciplinary throughout his entire career. He thought that the field of psychology was going in the wrong direction, that there were too many researchers in the field that were specialists, researchers that hunker down into one specific narrow topic, like, for example, a neuroscientist that only studies how neurons function but knows virtually nothing else about human behavior. So Becker thought the field was becoming filled with too many specialists and not enough generalists, and that this would eventually be a problem. So, okay, so he was interdisciplinary. The second point in his favor is that his analysis is synthetic, which just means that he was really good at sifting through large amounts of information. The guy literally read thousands of books, and then being able to pick out the most important insights and boil them down to the essentials. So he had a mind capable of doing that, which is of course necessary if you take seriously the goal of being interdisciplinary. So he was synthetic in his analysis. And third, his analysis was unassuming. So by this I just mean that he avoided the pitfalls of dismissing prior ideas simply because those ideas were older. Okay, so there's a tendency to do that in psychology. I'll give you an example. Contemporary psychologists since the 1960s typically dismiss most of Freud's ideas because some of his main ideas about things like the Oedipus complex and childhood sexuality turned out to be wrong. So because Freud was wrong about some things, the tendency is to just assume that all of his other ideas are silly and out of date and wrong as well. Okay. Even though psychoanalysis had actually been more or less disproven a whole decade before Becker began his own research, he still went back and read Freud's books and papers in their entirety so that he could make that determination on his own. In fact, as we'll see, much of what Becker is doing in this book, The Birth and Death of Meaning, and in his next two books, is he's trying to fix most of Freud's major mistakes and recast Freudian ideas to be in line with contemporary research. In the preface to this first book, The Birth and Death of Meaning, Becker begins by pointing out a disparity in the way people view the social sciences versus the natural sciences. In short, the social sciences are often viewed as soft, whereas the natural sciences are viewed as the hard sciences and as more important. So why is this? First, knowledge gained from the social sciences can be difficult to apply. So, for example, we know, based on a lot of years of systematic longitudinal research, that watching more violent TV as a child increases violent behavior later in life. So we know this to be true, especially for males, but what do we do with this knowledge? Well, we can impose rating systems on film and TV, and maybe even censor some really violent stuff, but ultimately it's up to parents to police their own kids. Can we really tell parents how to raise their kids? Certainly most parents would resist that kind of legislation or policy. And is it really desirable to eliminate all violence from the airways? What about sports? Hockey is one of the most violent sports, and most hockey fans, especially here in Canada, want that to remain part of the sport. They like that part, they like the violence, and believe that it makes the sport more exciting. Okay. So in comparison, there's usually very clear applications for knowledge gained in the natural sciences. If we find a cure for a disease, then we use that medicine to cure the disease, right? Like penicillin. Okay. All right, so the social sciences, knowledge gained in the social sciences is often more difficult to apply. The second problem is that discoveries made in the social sciences tend to point out our weaknesses and vulnerabilities. And we don't like to be reminded of our weaknesses and vulnerabilities. So, for example, the finding that watching violence leads to more violence just implies that human beings are kind of like automatons, right? Monkey see, monkey do. It doesn't really make us feel powerful and in control of our fate to know that watching violence just leads people to act that way. By comparison, discoveries made in the natural sciences tend to make us feel powerful and in control, right? So advances in medicine lead to cures for diseases. Advances in engineering and physics lead to better technology like cell phones and rockets that fly into outer space, and that makes us feel really special and important. So for these reasons, Becker suggests that the social sciences have an inherent image problem. Becker goes on to say that despite this image problem, some of the most profound discoveries about human beings have come from the social sciences. And one of these is the observation that people across all cultures have a pervasive need for self-esteem and to see the world and their place in it as meaningful and enduring. Some of my colleagues and I have put it this way: people need to believe that they're more significant than apes, lizards, and lima beans. That we're more than just animals taking in food, expelling waste, reproducing, and clinging to a clump of dirt, hurtling through space and time, just waiting to die. So why is this? Why do we need to believe that our existence is filled with meaning and purpose? So to address this question, Becker begins his analysis by asking two additional questions. The first of these is, how are we similar to other animals? Well, there's lots of similarities between humans and some of our closest animal relatives, but there should be one main thing that all life on this planet has in common. So if you take seriously the implications of Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection, then all life on this planet sprang from a common ancestor, and as such, all life must have at least one main thing in common with all other life forms. So Becker borrows this idea from one of Freud's lesser-known students, Otto Rank, who actually disagreed with Freud about many of his ideas. And Otto Rank said that all life forms possess what he called a life force, or a basic drive to survive and thrive. So for those of you who are maybe fans of the original Star Trek series and movies, it's like the old Vulcan saying, live long and prosper. Well, that's pretty much it, right? The Vulcans got it right. What we all really want to do is live a long time and prosper as much as possible while we're alive. Another way to put it is just we don't want to die, right? Not exactly on our list of things to do when we get up every morning. So this drive towards self-preservation, along with the drive to reproduce, are essentially the cornerstones of Darwin's theory of evolution, as portrayed in many movies and TV shows. So take, for example, the film Alive, which was based on a true story of a plane crash, or a plane that crashed in the Andes Mountains. Just a little bit of a spoiler alert here. These films are, I'm going to give you an example from two different films, but they're older films, so hopefully this will be okay. In order to survive up in the extremely cold and isolated terrain, the people that survived the plane crash had to resort to cannibalism, that is, eating the flesh of the other people in the plane that died in the crash, which in many cases were their friends and relatives. So they had to resort to cannibalism in order to survive long enough to be rescued. Okay, so that shows, I think, how powerful that drive to stay alive really is, to do something, you know, that we would all consider taboo. Another really powerful example comes from another film, a little bit more recent film called 127 Hours, which was also based on a true story. And this is the story about a guy named Aaron Ralston, who was an adventurer, hiker type guy, who was out hiking, and he slipped and fell while hiking in a narrow canyon, and he got his arm lodged between a boulder and the canyon wall, and he couldn't get free. Okay, so he was stuck there for about 4 days with no food and no water, and he even had to drink his own urine to stay hydrated. So eventually he figured out that the only way he's going to get out of this mess was if he used his camping knife to cut his arm off at the elbow joint and free himself from the boulder, and then hike out and try to be found by somebody before he bled to death. Okay, and so he did that, and he did actually survive. Okay, once again showing just how powerful this drive is. I mean, just imagine, you know, being in a situation where, you know, you have to cut your arm off in order to survive. It's crazy. To further understand how powerful this drive is, you know, think about a time perhaps when you were in a similar life-death situation, maybe not that extreme, but you thought, at least for a moment, that you might die, right? And that life force wells up inside of you, and you feel that desperation. The next question Becker asks us to consider is, how are we different from other animals? That is, what makes us unique as a species? So all organisms on this planet have evolved unique characteristics that help them survive. As a few examples, giraffes have long necks that help them reach the leaves at the tops of trees, which gives them an obvious survival advantage. Turtles have a hard shell that protects them from predators, and the gazelle can run really fast and evade most predators, but then, right, the cheetah can run really fast too, but only for shorter distances, just long enough to catch a few gazelles. So there's lots and lots of examples like that in the animal kingdom, but the point here is that we too have evolved some unique traits that help us survive. But evolution seems to have taken a different course for human beings, such that our unique traits have less to do with our physical abilities and have more to do with our mental abilities. To put it simply, what makes humans unique from other animals is the size and complexity of our brain, especially the part called the neocortex. So using our brain power, we can literally invent the means to survive and thrive in virtually every environmental niche on the planet. Okay, so it's a really good thing to be smart. Becker goes on to point out three types of thought that appear to be unique in human beings. Not that these abilities don't exist in other animals, they do, but that the human capacity for these types of thought far exceeds that of other animals like our closest living relatives, the chimpanzees and the great apes. So the first is temporal thought, which is just the ability to think about the past, the present, and the future. The second is symbolic thought, the ability to think using arbitrary symbols. And the third is self-reflective thought, which is the ability to treat the self as an object of attention. We can literally think about and focus on ourselves. All right, so having these three types of advanced cognitive abilities is a trait that sets humans apart from other species. But how did these cognitive abilities evolve? Well, Becker discusses three key evolutionary pressures that likely contributed to human intelligence. First, our human ancestors acquired a taste for meat, which motivated them to hunt in groups. They began living in large groups in close quarters, and at some point, our ancestors shifted from a standard breeding season to a monthly breeding cycle, which led to a greater need for sexual regulation. So there were certainly additional factors, but these are some of the main ones. And there is actually some really excellent fossil evidence showing that when our ancestors began to incorporate meat into their diet and live in larger and larger groups, their brain size also, in terms of the volume of their skulls, actually increased. Okay, so we know that these were important factors. A full discussion of these goes far beyond what we need to cover here, but the main takeaway point is that these evolutionary pressures placed a high premium on things like intimate cooperation and social organization, which requires higher levels of mental complexity. All right, another key factor, and one that had major implications for the evolution of human intelligence, is that humans are born into a state of extreme infantilization. So compared to most other animal species, human infants are born helpless and totally dependent on their parents for all of their survival needs. And this continues for an extended period of time. After being born, the human infant can't even lift its head or roll over on its own, let alone feed itself or avoid danger. So consider also that before any human can function independently in the world, we have to go through a really long period of training, and we can't really fend for ourselves until we're around 15 or 16 years old, sometimes longer. So compare that to most other animal species that grow up and survive on their own within a year of being born, and sometimes less. So this is interesting for me because I actually have a toddler at home. He's about 4.5 now. And when you're raising children, other parents often comment to each other and say things like, you know, they grow up so fast, right? And I think that's just something that parents say. And actually, from a parent's perspective, that seems true because we want our kids to remain cute babies forever. But in comparison to other species, nothing could be further from the truth. Human children actually grow up really, really, really slow. All right, so Becker goes on to point out that broadly speaking, there's two ways that organisms survive: through instinctual programming or through learning mechanisms. So as you go up the phylogenetic scale from simple organisms like amoebas and insects on up to dogs, dolphins, chimps, and humans, you see a pattern or a progression such that simple organisms with lower mental complexity tend to have more hardwired instinctual programming that governs their behavior. Organisms that are on this end of the spectrum therefore require less learning to survive because they depend more on instincts, and also need less care after being born. So just to illustrate this idea, I took a photo of my homemade fruit fly trap that you see on this slide, and all it is just a glass of white balsamic vinegar with a splash of glycerin, which just makes the vinegar sticky. So the reason why it works really well, indeed you can see all the dead flies at the bottom of the glass, is because fruit flies are instinctually programmed to go after rotted fermenting fruit. So they cannot resist the vinegar because it gives off that strong smell of rotting fruit. and so they fly right into the sticky mixture to their death. The point here is that their behavior is extremely rigid and instinctual and has no flexibility whatsoever. Even though they probably see the dead flies at the bottom of the glass, they still fly right into the vinegar. Okay? So no flexibility, lower levels of mental complexity. On the other end of the spectrum, organisms with higher levels of mental complexity tend to have less instinctual programming. They adapt to their environment more through learning mechanisms, especially modeling behavior from adults, and they also require more care to survive after birth. And human beings are at the extreme high end of this spectrum. We have the least amount of instinctual programming. We do have some, but we have relatively less compared to other animals. And we adapt largely through learning, and we need lots and lots of extended care to survive in the world. Okay, so organisms with higher mental complexity also have more infantilization. But what is it about infantilization that facilitates intelligence? Basically, if you want to develop a creature that's smart, that creature needs to be born before the brain is fully developed, so that its brain can continue to develop outside the womb in the context of learning and adapting to the physical and social environment. Consider this. Our closest living relatives, the chimpanzees, have roughly 70% of their brain size or capacity immediately after birth, whereas human infants don't get to the same 70% capacity until they're roughly 3 years old. So there's a huge difference between us and chimps in terms of delayed brain development. So for humans, the brain is continually developing and establishing new connections between the nerve cells for a very long time after birth. Interestingly, fossil evidence shows that a similar difference exists between modern humans and Neanderthals, who are an even closer relative to us. Adult Neanderthals basically have the same size brain as we do, but the Neanderthal brain develops to its full capacity much sooner than that of modern humans. So in other words, our brains are the same size as that of Neanderthals, but it takes us much longer to get to the same point. So once again, a longer period of brain development and being born in an immature state seems to be really important for the development of an intelligent organism. Okay, so as long as we're talking about infantilization, I just want to make one more point. Because human infants are born into such a helpless, dependent state, which is necessary for their brain development, this also means that human infants are always born into a peculiar and difficult situation. They need to develop, acquire knowledge, and are motivated to explore their environments so that they can become an autonomous human someday. But they have to do all this while being totally helpless and dependent on their parents for all of their survival needs. So this difficult dilemma has implications for the process of socialization and other processes that we're going to talk about later. But for now, I just wanted to make that point and just have you keep this in mind. So we've established that humans have big brains, but what are some consequences of having a big brain? Well, one major consequence that I've already sort of mentioned is that our high mental complexity affords us a high degree of what Becker calls freedom of reactivity. This is the notion that our complex mentality allows us to respond to environmental stimuli in ways that are flexible. So because we're smart, there are many, many different ways that we could respond to the same stimulus. Whereas the fruit fly has only one way to respond to vinegar at the bottom of a glass, humans have a limitless number of responses to a stimulus like that. So Becker points out that there's at least 4 different levels of freedom from reactivity among organisms. So at the lowest level is the reflex, which most organisms have. So this is like when the doctor hits your knee with a little hammer to test your reflexes, and then that makes your knee jerk uncontrollably. Right? It's a completely encapsulated response. You can't control that knee jerk. Or similarly, if you blow a puff of air into someone's eye, they can't help but blink. Okay? It's completely reflexive. The next level would be classical conditioning, like dogs, Pavlov's dogs learning to associate a bell with food. Next would be insightful problem solving, which involves putting two or more mental images together to form a new thought or idea. So this would be like a chimpanzee figuring out how to use a stool and a long stick to reach bananas that are hung high at the top of a ceiling. Okay, and finally, the highest level of freedom of reactivity is thinking with arbitrary symbols. So far, it seems that only human beings show this ability, at least in an advanced way, which involves using linguistic symbols to represent objects and events in the environment, even if those objects and events are not immediately present. Okay, so then the second major consequence of having a big brain that's important to point out is self-awareness. Okay, so self-awareness is that we can reflect on ourselves as objects of attention. We know that we exist. Indeed, without self-awareness, Descartes would never have been able to reach his famous conclusion, I think, therefore I am. And this ability also allows us to have a concept of self, or a mental representation of ourselves. All right, let's dwell a little bit longer on the topic of self-awareness, because being self-aware has a number of additional consequences, and some of these are positive and some of these are not so great. So the first one is that being self-aware gives us the capacity for awe. This idea comes from the Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard, and for the most part, this is considered a positive thing. All this means is that being self-aware allows us to be able to know what we're doing while we're doing it, which intensifies our emotional experiences. So for example, if you like downhill skiing, what makes that experience really fun and exciting is that you can be skiing down a high slope and know that you're doing it while you're doing it, which intensifies that emotional experience and creates a feeling of exhilaration and a high capacity for joy. Or you can hike to the top of a huge mountain and then look down and feel a sense of awe and wonder when you see everything down below that looks so small, right? And you can marvel at your accomplishment of hiking up that huge peak. So it's important to point out that this capacity for awe makes being human really awesome. All in all, it's better to be a human being than it is to be a potted plant, because we're self-aware and we can have these really intense and enjoyable emotional experiences. However, it also means that we have an increased love of being alive, which, as we'll discuss later, is a difficult thing to have to give up. A second positive consequence of being self-aware is that it allows us to engage in self-regulation. That is, we can set future goals and then regulate our behavior toward the accomplishment of those goals. In fact, that's precisely what all of you are doing by watching this lecture and attending other classes. You have some kind of career goal in mind, and you know that in order to reach that goal, you have to complete the required coursework and keep your grades up. And in order to do that, you have to discipline yourself to study, which means resisting temptations and distractions so that you can pass your classes, eventually graduate, and move on to the next phase of your life and career. So without self-awareness, you wouldn't be able to do any of these things. You wouldn't be able to regulate your behavior toward some desired future goal, and that's a really important thing to be able to do. A third consequence of self-awareness is that it creates conflicts between the self and the body. Children realize that they are a self, trapped in a physical body, and that these two things are not always compatible. So the developing mind often conflicts with bodily needs, urges, and physical limitations. So there's two such conflicts, and both create serious challenges for the developing child. The first of these is the developing mind of the child is curious and often wants to do things that the body is too weak and too uncoordinated to do just yet. So, for example, young kids want to do lots of fun things that they see adults do, like drive the car, or cook hamburgers on the gas grill, or ride a bicycle. But because the kid can't do these things yet, because the body just isn't capable of doing them. This leads to frustration and a sense of their physical limitations. So this is like the terrible twos, right? Where kids get frustrated and act out and have temper tantrums because they aren't allowed to do or can't do some of the things that they want to do. All right. The second conflict, and the one that has more important implications for our analysis, is that the body wants to do things that the developing mind won't let it do. So this is essentially the conflict between the id and the ego that Freud said played a really important role in the development of the self. So the id represents bodily desires or urges, and the ego is the part of the self that tries to satisfy those bodily urges within the context of the social environment, or in terms of what is socially acceptable. So this brings us to the process of socialization. The main task of the child in these early stages of life is to bring its own physical reality in line with social reality. This is how Becker defines socialization. Kids have to squash some of their intrinsic bodily desires in order to live by social rules. So the prototypical example of socialization, and the one that Freud emphasized, perhaps too much, is toilet training. Before toilet training, kids just go number 2 in their diapers, and then parents clean it up, no big deal. And in fact, it's very pleasurable for kids to just release their bowels, without having to hold it in. But eventually the parents and other adult caregivers, as you know, start to frown on such behavior, and they place new expectations on the child, like, you need to refrain from pooping in your pants and instead confine this activity to a ceramic bowl. So notice that this activity requires a great deal of self-regulation, and then when the child is successful in doing this, the parents offer affectionate praise, which then reinforces the child meeting this new seemingly weird social standard. So the entire growing up process is one in which the child has to basically squash intrinsic desires and bodily urges in order to abide by the rules of this new weird social world that doesn't make a whole lot of sense to children just yet. So socialization involves crushing our bodily urges to fit into the social world. But why don't kids just do what their body wants to do? Well, first of all, we might get squashed by parents and other adults. Kids know that they're small and vulnerable, and thus also know that going against anyone bigger than them could be dangerous. And second, they might lose love and security from the parents. If a child falls out of the good graces of the parents, there's the real possibility of being left alone or abandoned, or worse yet, these giants who are the child's sole source of protection could turn against him or her. So although kids do test boundaries and try to get away with stuff, they're ultimately in a position where they must conform to the parents' ideals and standards, or else their position in the world becomes very, very vulnerable. All right, so Becker explains that kids begin to push their bodily urges down and start to follow social rules in order to maintain love and protection from their parents. But then this begs the question, why is love and protection from parents, and then later from society, so important? Okay, well to answer that question, that brings us to the third consequence of having a big brain, which is dread. So earlier we discussed how humans possess some unique ways of thinking. Specifically, we have temporal thought, and thus can think about what might happen in the future. We also have self-awareness, and thus know that we exist. We also have a concept of self, and so we can project that concept of self forward in time. So together, an awareness of one's existence and of the passage of time makes human beings uniquely aware of their inevitable mortality. In other words, we know that eventually we're going to die. The way that this will likely play out is that we'll live to a ripe old age, and then at some point parts of our body will fail. Maybe we'll have a heart attack or a stroke, or maybe it'll be cancer. But that's really best case scenario, because we can also conceive of the possibility that our life will be cut short due to a sudden tragic event like a car accident. or something that we could never foresee or control. In fact, statistics tell us that 5 to 10% of people in the population will die due to some freak accident before living out a full life. And if just the knowledge of our inevitable death and that it could happen at any time isn't terrifying enough, we also know that we're animals and that all animals made of flesh and blood are thus doomed to decay and die. So any reminder of our animal nature is also a reminder of our mortality. So because humans have the intelligence to know that we're animals and that animals eventually must die, this creates a potential for death anxiety in human beings that other animals don't seem to possess. To elaborate, let's turn back to an earlier point in our discussion. So remember, we started by noting that humans have one thing in common with all other life forms on this planet. Specifically, we have a really powerful life force that kicks in when we're faced with an imminent threat to our survival. So on the one hand, like other animals, we possess a powerful motive to survive. However, unlike other animals, we have the intelligence to know that this motive to survive and thrive will eventually give way to death. So this conflict between a motive to go on living and the knowledge of our inevitable death creates a huge potential for existential terror that other animals don't have. This is called the human existential dilemma. Becker doesn't actually bring this idea into his analysis until we get to his second book, The Denial of Death, and I don't think he actually figured that part out until he had already finished The Birth and Death of Meaning. So we're actually skipping ahead a little bit here. In any case, Becker explains that this existential terror, if experienced unchecked, would undermine many of the adaptive benefits of self-awareness, self-regulation, and being smart in general, because acute anxiety interferes with effective thought and action. Indeed, people who are depressed and who experience a lot of anxiety have a really hard time with day-to-day functioning. So humans needed a way of managing this potential for death-related fear. Becker thought that the way humans manage anxiety in general, and anxiety about death more specifically, is through self-esteem and culture. All right, but what is self-esteem and how does it help us manage anxiety? To answer that question, we need to briefly discuss John Bowlby's theory of attachment. Remember earlier in this lecture I made the point that because they're born into a state of extreme infantilization, human infants must grapple with having to learn and explore their environment so they can eventually become autonomous humans, but also they have to do this while being totally helpless and dependent on their parents for survival. So humans, like all mammals, have a basic motive to play, master new skills, and explore their environment, but they also have a competing motive to stay safe and secure. These two motives often conflict because exploration takes the infant away from the safe proximity to caregivers, and safe proximity to caregivers in turn limits the infant's ability to explore and learn new information. Okay, so according to Bowlby, the attachment mechanism evolved to balance these two opposing needs for exploration and safety or survival. Here's how it works. When the infant gets too far away from parents, they experience anxiety or pain, which prompts proximity seeking to the parents for protection. Thus, anxiety is reduced by soothing, warm contact with the parents. Once the infant gets a dose of security from the parent, he or she then feels safe enough to resume play and exploration. So attachment helps keep exploration in check, just enough so that the infant stays safely connected to mom and dad and is safe from predators or other dangers lurking in the environment. However, as we noted earlier, for humans, eventually mom and dad start to place expectations on children to act in certain ways according to social rules. Once this starts to happen, Warm, soothing contact that signals feeling safe and secure is dispensed based on the following contingencies: being good and following parental and social standards for appropriate behavior equals a feeling of safety and security, whereas being bad and going against parental standards equals feeling vulnerability and anxiety. Once children learn these basic contingencies, the innate attachment mechanism is then transformed into a standard-based psychological system for managing anxiety. Living up to parental standards is associated with feeling emotionally connected to the parents and feeling safe and secure. This transformation from attachment to self-esteem as a way of managing basic fears and anxieties is summed up really well by Becker on page 67. So on that page he says, the entire early training period of the child is one in which he learns to switch modes of maintaining self-esteem. The child learns painfully that he cannot earn parental approval or self-esteem by continuing to express himself with his body. He finds that he has to conduct himself according to symbolic codes of behavior in order to be accepted and supported. In other words, his vital sentiment of self-value no longer derives from the mother's milk, or warm, soothing physical contact, but from the mother's mouth. So what exactly is self-esteem? Becker defines self-esteem as the culturally derived sense that one is an object of primary value in a world of unshakable meaning. In order to have self-esteem, a person must have standards through which to evaluate the self. These standards tell us what kinds of behaviors are good and what is bad. These standards always come from outside the self, that is, standards for appropriate behavior always come from the social world, which is external to the self. Eventually, a person might internalize these standards as their own, such that it feels like it's coming from inside of them. But in fact, these standards always initially come from the outside in, right? From other people. And these standards change over the lifespan and are relative to the culture one is born into. So when we're young, we get self-esteem by meeting parental standards for being a good little boy or a good little girl. Later in the teen years, self-esteem is gained by being cool and trying to fit in. And then later into adulthood, these standards are more about being successful in one's career or accomplishments, and filling social roles that are recognized and valued within the culture. All right, so Becker defines self-esteem as the culturally derived sense that one is an object of primary value. So let's talk about that culturally derived part of self-esteem and the role of culture. According to Becker, you can't have self-esteem without culture. Cultures are humanly constructed, shared beliefs about the nature of reality that give human existence meaning, order, and stability. So cultures lay the foundation for how people go about earning a sense of meaning and value in life, which ultimately functions to help people deal with the fear of death or existential terror. Okay, so there's a piece to the puzzle missing from our analysis so far. We've said that self-esteem helps people deal with anxiety about death, and self-esteem comes from culture. So together, self-esteem and culture help people deal with the problem of death, but how specifically do they do that? Well, they do that by answering really big, important questions about the nature of human existence. Questions like, where did we come from? Every cultural worldview provides some kind of answer to this question. So, for example, in religious cultures, everything, including humans, were created by God or some supernatural force. In Christianity, for example, this is the creation account where God created everything in 6 days and then took a well-deserved break on the 7th day. But even if you're not religious, you might adhere to a secular scientific worldview which explains that everything got started with a Big Bang where all the matter and energy in the universe exploded and expanded, and then clump together to form galaxies with separate solar systems containing suns and planets orbiting around them. And it just so happens that on one planet the conditions were just right for life to spring forth as simple single-cell organisms. Then there was billions of years of evolution, yada yada yada, and abracadabra, here we are. Okay, so that's the secular scientific account. Okay, so this helps to explain things for us, and these cultural accounts of how everything came to be then has implications for how cultures answer the next really important existential question for us. Specifically, what are we supposed to be doing with our lives while we're here on this planet? Okay, what's the point of it all? In other words, cultures lay down value prescriptions, or, as we've already said, standards for self-esteem. And these standards for self-esteem, as we've already mentioned, are culturally relative, meaning that what one does to be a hero in one culture could potentially land them in jail if they acted that way in another culture, right? So cultures have very different ways of telling us what kinds of behaviors are appropriate and what kinds of behaviors are not. So, for example, in Western individualistic cultures, we value being special and standing out from the crowd as unique, whereas in some collectivist cultures, for example, say Japan, being humble and playing down one's accomplishments and promoting group harmony is valued as heroic. So two very different approaches there. Okay, so finally, cultures answer the question, what happens to us after we die? In this way, cultures provide people with a way of transcending death. So if you're religious, then your cultural worldview tells you that if you follow the teachings of your religion, your soul will go to heaven after you die, and you'll live forever, yay. So in this way, some cultures provide their members with a sense of literal immortality if they live up to the standards of that worldview. But even non-religious cultures provide their members with a hope of death transcendence. So for example, if you espouse a more secular scientific worldview, you might have the hope of living forever through the contributions you make as a scientist. For example, publishing some really important papers that get cited in all the textbooks and are then passed down to the next generation. Indeed, people can feel like they live on through their creative works of art, athletic accomplishments, or even having children that live on after one dies and pass on their legacy. Okay, so these are different ways that people can earn a sense of symbolic immortality, a feeling that some part of them lives on in the culture after they die. All right, here's a crude summary of Becker's analysis so far. I won't read the entire slide, I'll let you guys do that. I should also mention there was a lot of other information in the readings that have been assigned that I haven't covered yet, but we will cover those parts as we discuss the films in class and go over the study questions. But this first lecture provides the core analysis that lays the foundation for all the ideas that we'll talk about through the first part of the course.